Welcome back to Feeding His Sheep. I'm Rick Griffin, and thank you for joining us as we dive into Daniel chapter 3. In our previous study in chapter 2, Daniel gave an interpretation of this recurring dream that was haunting King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. Now, if you remember, that dream was about a giant statue that was made of different types of metals in each section. The top was gold, and then it moved on to silver, brass, iron, and then eventually clay mixed with iron at the very bottom. Every section that replaced the previous one was of a less valuable metal, and it was therefore less glorious, less majestic. What Nebuchadnezzar failed to realize was that each succeeding material was also stronger than the previous one as well. The purpose of this dream was to foretell the future of what empires are going to come after Babylon. These included Persia, Greece, and Rome, which have already been fulfilled before our lifetime. Then there is a prophetic gap somewhere around the ankles of that statue. Then we're told about the coming empire of the Antichrist after the rapture and during the Great Tribulation. But Nebuchadnezzar heard nothing past the fact that his empire was this head of gold on the statue. I think he immediately just started daydreaming and basking in his own glory once he heard that. Now, where we picked up in chapter 3, some scholars say that a significant amount of time has passed. Chapter 2 occurred nearly immediately after the end of chapter 1, but there's a gap between 2 and 3 that some say is between 10 and 15 years. If Daniel and his 3 friends were teenagers upon arriving in Babylon, this would put them in their 30s or so right here. Now, as for what happened during that 10 to 15 year time gap, we can get some idea from the other prophets who were active at the same time. But by and large, Nebuchadnezzar himself was not very active, or at least he had no major accomplishments during that period that history notes. But we will see within the first 7 verses of chapter 3 that Nebuchadnezzar hasn't changed much. The wonder and awe that he felt about God after having his dream told to him and interpreted by Daniel has faded. It's all been but forgotten, and he is back to being a prideful pagan. He still enjoys making kibbles and bits out of anyone who disagrees with him. But one thing from that day has never left Nebuchadnezzar's mind. He was the head of that greatest empire. He was the golden head, and no empire that would come after him could hold a candle to his glory. In Daniel chapter 3, let's begin with verses 1 through 7. Nebuchadnezzar the king made an image of gold, the height of which was 60 cubits, and its width 6 cubits, and he set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Then Nebuchadnezzar the king sent word to assemble the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the rulers of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. Then the satraps, prefects, governors, counselors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the rulers of the provinces were assembled for the dedication of the image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up, and they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Then a herald loudly proclaimed, "To you the command is given, O peoples, nations, and men of every language, that at the moment you hear the sound of the horn, flute, lyre, trigon, psaltery, bagpipe, and all kinds of music, you are to fall down and worship the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king has set up. But whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be cast into the midst of a furnace of blazing fire." Therefore at that time, when all the peoples heard the sound of the horn, flute, lyre, trigon, psaltery, bagpipe, and all kinds of music, all the peoples, nations, and men of every language fell down and worshipped the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. Obviously, he's gotten hung up on that dream of his from the previous chapter. He decides to make that statue a reality, something that can be seen, something tangible, and he's going to make some changes to it. Instead of just a golden head, the entire statue is gold. Now, more than likely, it's gold plating over either wood or metal, but eliminating the other types of metal, the silver, the iron, and the bronze that represented future empires and future rulers, he's asserting asserting that if it's all gold, he's never going to be replaced. He thinks that his reign will never come to an end. Now, check out the dimensions of this statue as well. Getting out of the cubits, let's go into the standard system. 90 feet high and 9 feet wide. Now that is extremely tall, but it's not really very wide. If this statue was made to resemble Nebuchadnezzar himself, he better eat a few cheeseburgers and put some meat on his bones, because that's just really tall and too skinny. Now, interestingly, I was listening to David Guzik from Enduring Word talk about this, and he said this about the area where this all takes place. He said, on the plains of Dura, there stands today a mound about 20 feet high, an exact square about 46 feet at the base, resembling the pedestal of a colossal statue. Now, I looked on the internet for pictures of this discovery, and I couldn't find any. Maybe I was searching in the wrong place. But this discovery of this colossal pedestal in the plains of Dura, could that be the base for this statue that we're talking about here today? It's quite possible. In verse 2, there's a list of titled positions that you might have noticed get repeated several times, along with a list of instruments that gets repeated. Maybe this was just the style of writing that they used, or maybe it's because it's the easiest way for somebody to remember it all when they passed along the story orally. Or maybe one of the musicians would have been offended if their instrument was left out of one of these verses. We simply don't know. What I want you to notice here is that the crowd did not consist of the citizens of Babylon. These were all nobles, those who held positions of importance and influence within the Babylonian government, sort of the Ivy League or the who's who of Babylon. Strangely, if you notice, Daniel isn't named among those who are present at this. At the end of chapter 2, Daniel was given a position higher than anyone in the land except for King Nebuchadnezzar, just like the account in Genesis of Joseph in Egypt, who was second only to Pharaoh. Now, this gives us the possibility that Daniel remained behind in Babylon in the absence of the king and all of these officials, perhaps just to hold down the fort. Daniel was keeping things going at the palace, possibly. But Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael, or as you may remember them, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they were among those summoned to go to the plain of Dura for this great unveiling of this statue. Now, while everyone is standing around just gawking at this humongous statue, a herald announces a new decree from the king. When they were to hear this sound of the symphony from these 6 different instruments that are mentioned, they are to stop what they're doing, lay prostrate on the ground, and worship this statue, in effect worshiping Nebuchadnezzar in the process. Now, this might be a foreshadow of what's to come in the future during the tribulation as well. Remember that I've said before that the devil has his counterfeit version of the Trinity? There will be the Antichrist, the beast, and the false prophet. The Antichrist will suffer a fatal head wound and then rise from the dead. This will cause a lot of people on the earth to worship him as he claims to be the Messiah. But there's also going to be a big statue or image there, just like this one. But this statue that's coming in Revelation is going to be even more blasphemous and more demonic. Really quickly, in Revelation 13, verses 14 and 15, it says, "And he deceives those who dwell on the earth because of the signs which it was given to him to perform in the presence of the beast, telling those who dwell on the earth to make an image to the beast who had had the wound of the sword and has come to life. And it was given to him the breath to the image of the beast, so that the image of the beast would even speak, and cause as many that do not worship the image of the beast to be killed." Now, Nebuchadnezzar's statue couldn't speak, but the orders here are the same. You're going to worship the image or you're going to die, plain and simple. Now, this sounds like something only a vain madman would command, and that's a fair assessment of Nebuchadnezzar. But was that the only reason that the king was doing this, just to get people to worship him or worship this statue that he dreamed about? I don't think so. First off, it was just the people who held prominent positions within that palace. Remember, we read all about these positions, judges, magistrates, all of that. All of those who had an employment in the domain of Babylon. They're employees, if you will. Second, remember that a great number of these king's employees were not native Babylonians, but people who were captives from other countries that they've conquered. Remember, like Daniel and his three friends, they sent him through 3 years of re-education, trying to make Babylonians out of them, trying to absorb them into their culture. Now look at the last part of verse 7 again, where it describes these people that were in the crowd. All the peoples, nations, and men of every language. So in this crowd, we know that there are many men from Judah. We know at least 3 of them by name. That's in our text today. There's also some Israelites there who were captured by Assyria 100 or so years earlier. And Assyria was absorbed by Babylon when they were conquered. So it's safe to assume that there's Judahites, there's Israelites, there's Assyrians there. And we also know that Babylon defeated Egypt. So bank on some Egyptians being in this crowd. The same for the nation of Tyre and several other nations. I read a commentary that said it's even possible that the Scottish could have been among the conquest of Nebuchadnezzar because of the mention of bagpipes in the NASB translation. So if you're a king and you're paranoid, and you're rightfully so because you're surrounded by all these foreigners, how do you know if you could trust them? How do you know that you can trust them to serve you if they're not native to Babylon? And I think this was possibly a test. Are these people fully integrated into Babylonian society and culture? Are they going to be loyal to do the king's bidding, or do they still hold to their own nationality? Do they still hold to their own religion? Do they still hold to their old life? Now, refusing to follow this command is going to be equal to treason in Nebuchadnezzar's eyes. You find out who your friends are, the old saying is, and you're also going to find out who's going to remain faithful to their God no matter the cost. Let's go on into verses 8 through 12 and see. For this reason, at that time, certain Chaldeans came forward and brought charges against the Jews. They responded and said to Nebuchadnezzar the king, O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that every man who hears the sound of the horn, the flute, lyre, trigon, psaltery, and bagpipe, and all kinds of music is to fall down and worship the golden image. But whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast in the midst of a furnace of blazing fire. There are certain Jews whom you have appointed over the administration of the province of Babylon, namely Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, have disregarded you, that do not serve your gods or worship the golden image which you have set up. It says here that certain Chaldeans approached the king. Well, it doesn't take a genius to figure out exactly who these people are. Remember the enchanters, the sorcerers, and the Chaldeans who were unable to meet the king's demand about interpreting the dream? These guys are still upset over having been shown up by Daniel and his friend. Never mind that Daniel pleaded for their lives and asked that they be spared. They obviously still held a grudge. Or maybe it was just a group of native Babylonians who are not really pleased with the king's policy of having foreigners in position of authority in their own country. So whatever their motive is, these people, they approach the king and they start by buttering him up with flattery. Did you see that? Oh, king, live forever. Then they repeat his command, word for word, making sure that the king knows that they paid attention to him and they took him seriously, meaning that these other people are not. And we see a combination of these motives we just talked about here. Bitterness over having been shown up by these 4 men and the fact that they were foreigners placed in charge. They said, there are certain Jews that you have appointed over the administration of the province of Babylon. There's the foreigners. Namely, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. There's the grudge because they called them out by name. They have waited for years for an opportunity to get these guys in trouble. They couldn't get Daniel. They couldn't get any dirt on him. And it was fortunate for Daniel that he wasn't there, because he would have refused as well. As we go further into this book, you're going to see that Daniel didn't care about earthly laws when it came to being obedient to God. He was obedient to God first, and everything else had to fall in line with that. For years, they have not been able to get these guys in hot water for anything. That tells me a lot about the integrity and the character of these four men. But they finally think they have these three right where they want them, don't they? Let's go on into verses 13 through 18. Then Nebuchadnezzar, in a rage and anger, gave orders to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Then these men were brought before the king. Nebuchadnezzar responded and said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image that I have set up? Now, if you are ready at the moment that you hear the sound of the horn, flute, lyre, trigon, psaltery, and bagpipe, and all kinds of music, to fall down and worship the image that I have made, very well. But if you do not worship, you will immediately be cast into the midst of a furnace of blazing fire. And what God is there who can deliver you out of my hands?" Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to give you an answer concerning this matter. If it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the furnace of blazing fire, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But even if he does not, let it be known to you, O king, that we are not going to serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up." We see in verse 13 that old hot temper is still controlling this king. It's still making him do rash things, and he doesn't put hardly a thought to his actions. Now in verse 14, he had these three young men summoned. They brought them to him. He repeated the accusation, and he asked them, "Boys, is this true? You know, it should have been obvious when all that music blared and everyone in the plain of Dura was flat on the ground except for these three young men who were standing firm in their defiance. They should stand out like three sore thumbs. They were the only ones that remained standing." I think that just a tiny bit of rationality was poking through the king's rage here, because he seems to be wanting to give them a second chance. Even though he's angry, he's willing to have the entire orchestra of instruments do it all over again and make the entire crowd go through this whole ritual one more time just because of these guys. In verse 15, he asked them, "Is there a God who can deliver someone out of my hands?" Well, Nebuchadnezzar is about to find out. If the dream thing didn't change his heart that much, more drastic measures are in order. And I absolutely love the response they gave to the king. They showed no fear whatsoever, yet they remain calm. They're firm, but they're respectful and they're calm. They are not going to do anything to violate God's commandments. They had only spent their childhood growing up in Judah. Think of that. At that time, Judah was full of idolatry and waywardness. That's why they are in exile. But not these boys. Their parents must have drilled God's word and obedience into them from the beginning. More than likely, passages come up to their mind that they had heard before, like Leviticus chapter 26, verse 1. "You shall not make for yourselves idols, nor shall you set up for yourselves an image or a sacred pillar, nor shall you place a figured stone in your land to bow down to it, for I am the Lord your God." There may eventually come a time when you are going to have to defy someone in authority or somebody that's over you if they demand that you do something that is a sin. But hear me out. You would be wise and you would be a much more effective witness if you handle that situation with respect and gentleness like these guys did. Be firm in everything, but don't belittle them. Don't throw a tantrum. Be polite, but be firm. And Christians, pick your battles, please. Don't cause a big scene over something minor. You know, an example today, if you're asked to work on Christmas or Easter, it isn't the end of the world. There's no reason to start a protest and to boycott this factory or whatever it is. If your employer says that you can't witness to your coworkers, if it's already a written policy for that company, you have to play by their rules. Now, if they're making these rules as they go up and they're targeting you, that would be different. But if, witnessing to somebody, they would call it, sharing your faith, whatever. If that's already a pre-existing written policy, you have to go by that rule. That's a condition of your employment that you agreed to when you started there. But if it was me, I would start looking elsewhere for employment if I was in a circumstance like that. But if your company that you work for asks you to cheat on paperwork, or tamper with files, or destroy evidence that's going to make them look bad, or if they willingly want you to defraud a customer or rip somebody off, then you should refuse. If anyone in authority over you demands that you do something that is a clear and a major violation of God's word, then civil disobedience might be required of the faithful. But also be prepared to face the consequences of taking your stand for what is right. Regardless of who or what the person in authority is over you, they might take action against you. They might take legal action. Possibly they could take financial action against you or judicial action. The day might come even soon when imprisonment and death may be the penalty for taking a stand for righteousness. Peter was ordered to stop preaching about Jesus, and he said, we must obey God rather than men. The Hebrew midwives disobeyed Pharaoh, who commanded that all the male Hebrew children be killed, and God rewarded them for that. There is a time and a place to take a stand for God, and if you find yourself in a position where you must do such a thing, make absolutely sure that you're doing it for the right reason and for a just cause, and be prepared to accept the penalty and pay the cost for choosing God over human authority. These guys, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they were ready to do just that. They knew that God was certainly able to deliver them from this. They even said so. Our God whom we serve is able to deliver us. God can do anything. Nothing is too big for God. Nothing is too small for Him either. But remember, they didn't put God in a box here. They understood that God has a will, and sometimes His will may not be the most pleasant for all that are involved. In the epistles of Peter that we studied verse by verse, Peter tells us that sometimes it can even be the will of God that we suffer. Suffering can shape us, it can mold us, it can make us stronger, and it will glorify God when we are delivered from it or when we come through it honoring Him. Sometimes the things God does doesn't make sense. I'll admit there's been several times in my life I've been stumped by the way that He answers prayer, but I know that His ways are higher than my ways. He has His reasons for doing things His way. From His eternal perspective, He knows more than we do. And I trust that He is going to do what's best, even if I don't understand it at the time. These guys knew and were ready to accept God's will, either way, even if that meant that they're going to be fried. In Daniel 3:18, they said, but even if He does not, let it be known to you, O king, that we are not going to serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. They knew that it was very possible that God could let them perish that day. And they had the eternal perspective to know that they would spend eternity in His presence regardless of anything that might happen in this short life. A little bit of temporary pain and suffering now, and eternal life of rewards and bliss later. That sounds like a good deal to me. And we'll go on into verses 19 through 23. Then Nebuchadnezzar was filled with wrath, and his facial expression was altered toward Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He answered by giving orders to heat the furnace 7 times more than it was usually heated. He commanded certain valiant warriors who were in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in order to cast them into the furnace of blazing fire. Then these men were tied up in their trousers, their coats, their caps, and their other clothes, and were cast into the midst of the furnace of blazing fire. For this reason, because of the king's command was urgent and the furnace had been made extremely hot, the flame of the fire slew those men who carried up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell into the midst of the furnace of blazing fire, still tied up. In my house, I have stacks and stacks of commentaries from some of the greatest and the wisest of Christian minds that there are. I could quote many wise things pertaining to verse 19 from them, but let me use an unexpected source, someone that you may not expect me to quote. In the 1990s, in the first live-action Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles movie, a character named Splinter, of course you know Splinter, the walking, talking rat that trained the turtles, he told one of his students that anger clouds the mind. Now that might not be a source you would expect to hear from me here, and I don't suggest using Hollywood for much else, but that line has stuck with me ever since I was a kid. Anger clouds the mind, and it is so true. When we're angry, we lose our ability to focus. We lose the ability to make right and sound choices. We say things that we're later going to regret, and we do things that we later regret, and we end up making a complete mess of things. And here, Nebuchadnezzar puts that example on full display, that anger clouds the mind. In verse 19, it says his facial expression and attitude towards these men changed. They were valuable assets. They were loyal to the king in every other manner that was reasonable. You couldn't ask for better employees. You couldn't ask for better servants. But in a fit of rage, he's ready to have them killed like they're nothing. Instead of the usual punishment of Nebuchadnezzar, chop them up into tiny cubes and make their houses a dung pile, he answered by giving orders to heat this furnace 7 times more than it's usually heated. Now, have you ever read this before and wondered, why did he happen to have a fiery furnace at his disposal in the middle of nowhere in this pasture out in Dura? Was it like the old Bugs Bunny cartoons where they just pull anything and everything out of their back pockets? Rockets, anvils, whatever they happen to need. Well, think about this, what they're out there for. This statue. Transporting a statue that is 90 feet long would be a logistical nightmare. More than likely, this furnace was a kiln or a smelter of sorts that was erected on site and used to smelt the metals or the gold while building the statue. If the statue was built on site, that explains the presence of this giant oven that's there. And in a fit of rage, lacking any semblance of common sense, Nebuchadnezzar orders this furnace to be heated to 7 times its normal operating temperature, of which it was used to melt the gold. So I looked this up. Gold has a melting point of 1,064 degrees for the cheaper stuff, 1,948 degrees for the other end of the spectrum, depending on the purity of your gold. But we'll just go with 1,948 degrees. So the king wanted this oven to be between 7,400 and 13,636 degrees. That's 7 times the melting point of gold. Just a few ticks over 100 degrees for a prolonged period of time is dangerous for a human body. Even if the stove was at the most conservative estimate of 1,064 degrees, and for the normal, the lowest temperature which you can melt gold, that would do the job. In fact, in January of 2024, I stumbled across this article. It's tragic, but it's just shocking to me. An elderly couple perished in their home when their heater malfunctioned and overheated the house. The New York Post said that firefighters thought the house was on fire, but it was the glow of the heater which made the temperature in the house well over 1,000 degrees. I did not know that was possible with a normal heater. Well, what if the one used by Nebuchadnezzar was actually capable of getting 7 times hotter than the melting point of pure gold? So somewhere around 13,000 degrees Fahrenheit is what this would have to be if it was literally 7 times. 13,000 degrees. The surface of the sun is said to only be 10,000 degrees. So I don't believe it was exactly 7 times hotter. They don't have digital thermostats. They have no way of telling such a thing. But the orders were made to make this as hot as possible, or else they're going to make this stove give it all that it's capable of. Now, there are people who constantly try to debunk things that happen in the Bible that are miraculous. Someone tried to to tell me once that the Red Sea crossing wasn't really a miracle. They claim that at certain times of the year, one part of the Red Sea is only 2 inches deep, even though the Bible says they walked through on dry ground. They said the sea is only 2 inches deep, and that's where the nation of Israel crossed the Red Sea. I told them, well, then you've got another miracle, because Pharaoh and his entire army and horses all drowned in that 2 inches of water shortly after the people of Israel crossed. Some will try to say that these 3 men survived this fiery furnace because it wasn't that hot. Or maybe they found a pocket that made it look like they were in the fire, but they were actually behind it out of harm's way. Really? Then explain verse 22 to me that said, because the king's command was urgent and the furnace had been made extremely hot, the flame of the fire slew the men who carried up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. It killed their executioners. That fire was hot enough to kill them. If they say that these were weak men who just fainted and succumbed to the heat, explain verse 20, where it described these as certain valiant warriors who were in his army. You know, when I have a fire going in the wood stove in my house on a cold day, I like to stand next to it and warm up. And if you stand there too long, you don't realize how hot you got until you walk away and your jeans start melting your flesh with every step. And I just wonder if I'm that hot outside of the furnace, can you imagine the logs and the coals inside that same stove not being burned if it burned me outside the stove? That would be an oddity. The fire killed these valiant warriors who were next to it outside of the stove, and they fell dead. Verse 23 tells us that these young Hebrews rolled into the furnace, all tied up and bound with ropes. Let's go on into verses 24 through 27. Then Nebuchadnezzar the king was astounded and stood up in haste. He said to his high officials, was it not 3 men we cast bound into the midst of the fire? They replied to the king, certainly, O king. He said, look, I see 4 men loosed and walking about in the midst of the fire without harm, and the appearance of the 4th is like a son of the gods. Then Nebuchadnezzar came near to the door of the furnace of blazing fire. He responded and said, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, come out, you servants of the Most High God, and come here. Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the midst of the fire. The satraps, the prefects, the governors, and the king's high officials gathered around and saw in regard to these men that the fire had no effect on their bodies of these men, nor was the hair of their heads singed, nor were their trousers damaged, nor had the smell of fire even come upon them. In verse 24, when it says the king was astounded, that's the understatement of the year. First off, how can these guys be walking around and they're unharmed when it killed the guards who just got next to this thing? Second, who, how, and where did this 4th figure come from? I find it odd that he came to the conclusion of who this 4th was. Some translations say like the son of the gods. Some say like the son of God. How could Nebuchadnezzar have known hundreds of years before Jesus was born? First, it's possible that God inspired him to say that or revealed it to him that was Jesus, because remember Simon Peter, when he says, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Jesus said, blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood did not reveal this to you, but the Father. So it's possible that God inspired Nebuchadnezzar to say that. Second, it's possible that he drew from his background in diverse pagan false gods, and he took a guess that this God might have a son. One thing that most commentators and preachers do agree on is that this was indeed Jesus. This is called a Christophany, a pre-incarnate appearance of Jesus, an Old Testament appearance. Remember, Jesus didn't begin to exist in Bethlehem. He was in the beginning. He was with God and he was God. He is God. There are other places in the Old Testament that he appears. The text refers to him as the angel of the Lord. When the word Lord is in all caps, it's actually translated YHWH, what we call Yahweh, the covenant name of God. It refers to him as the angel of the Lord when it's in all caps. This was the time that he appeared to Hagar after Sarah made Abraham drive her away. Then he appeared to Gideon, and there's several other places that don't make it clear, but it could possibly be him. But we know in Genesis 1 that he was there, co-creating the world, because God used plural pronouns. Let us make man in our image. Maybe what told Nebuchadnezzar that this was the Son of God was the presence of the Shekinah glory of God. This was displayed when Jesus gave Peter, James, and John a sneak peek during the Transfiguration. When he spoke to Moses and Elijah up on the mountain, the scripture says he shone with a blinding brilliance of light. Regardless of whether this was revealed to the king or if he just guessed, it got his attention, and he called these three to come out of the fire. Obviously, the ropes disintegrated in the inferno because they were up and walking around, and nothing else was singed, though. The ropes were gone, but nothing else was. They walked out and looked like nothing had ever happened. Verse 27 said the fire had no effect on their body of these men. The hair on their head wasn't singed. Their trousers weren't damaged. They didn't even smell like smoke. Now, I admit there's a lot of times that I lost my eyebrows and my bangs more than I cared to admit playing with fire as a kid. The hair on my arm gets singed off at least once a year at work. And it only takes a second to fry hair. Just one brilliant flash, and then all of a sudden it's gone. It's crispy. When I burn brush outside, even if I try to avoid the smoke remains in my clothes and jacket until they are washed, and sometimes the smoke even lingers after several washings. These guys didn't lose a single eyelash, nor did they reek of smoke. Besides remembering the command in Leviticus about not bowing down to idols and images and such, I bet they remembered passages like when Isaiah was talking about this sort of thing. Isaiah 33:14 says, "Sinners in Zion are terrified. Trembling has seized the godless. Who among us can live with the consuming fire? Who among us can live with continual burning?" Then Isaiah 43:2 says, "When you pass through the waters, I will be with you, and through the rivers they will not overflow you. When you walk through the fire, you will not be scorched, nor will the flame burn you." Now let me add a disclaimer here. Do not try this at home. Fire will burn you, people. The Bible tells us do not put the Lord your God to the test. Now, I believe that He is able to protect us from harm, just like He did those guys in that day. He's the same God yesterday, today, and forever. But even they acknowledge the possibility that it may not be God's will that they not get burned. We would think that the will of God would not put us in harm's way. I mean, why didn't God blind the Chaldeans who snitched? Why didn't He have these three stay behind in Babylon instead of coming to the plain of Dura? Why couldn't they stay behind like Daniel did? He did that so that they could have an impact on everyone who was there that day. And everyone saw that there was only one true and living God. Had Daniel been there, perhaps the king wouldn't have gotten as mad as he did with these three, because Nebuchadnezzar knows Daniel much more than he knows these guys. Sometimes God allows us to go through fiery trials. Sometimes He might even allow you to be burned a little bit. Sometimes a trial may be there to bring us closer to Him. Sometimes a trial may even bring us home to Him. But to live is Christ, to die is gain for the believer. So we win either way. And God will make Himself known through those whom He allows to go through the fire. We'll see in a minute that even this king acknowledged that God is supreme over all. But before we would go on, I want to point out that it never said that these three saw Jesus. It never said Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did. Only the king and those who were outside the furnace. Maybe they saw Him, maybe they didn't. You can ask them when we get to heaven. But I want you to remember this whenever you're going through a trial of your own. You might be going through one right now. You may not see Jesus, but rest assured, He is right there with you through it all. Now let's go ahead and close with verses 28 through 30. Nebuchadnezzar responded and said, "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants who put their trust in him, violating the king's command and yielded up their bodies so as not to serve or worship any god except their own God. Therefore I make a decree that any people, nation, or tongue that speaks anything offensive against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb, and their houses reduced to a rubbish heap, inasmuch as there is no other God who is able to deliver in this way." Then the king caused Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to prosper in the province of Babylon. So Nebuchadnezzar gave glory to God, but it didn't say that this great God that he was glorifying was his God. He called God the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Nebuchadnezzar's not quite there yet, but he's getting ever so much closer. Remember, no one is unsavable. Even the most unlikely person that you can think of may be closer to coming to faith than you think. Remember that when you're chastised or for witnessing to someone or sharing your faith, when they get hostile against you, when you throw a rock at a pack of dogs, the one that's going to bark the loudest is the one that you hit. Conviction can make a lost person lash out in anger as they find themselves unable to disprove what we know to be a reality. So that person that's angry at you for sharing their faith, maybe it's the Holy Spirit putting conviction upon their heart and making them uncomfortable. And while we're on the topic of sharing our faith, don't do like Nebuchadnezzar did. He didn't go about it the best possible way. In Daniel 3:29, "Therefore I make a decree that any people, nation, or tongue that speaks anything offensive against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb, and their houses reduced to a rubbish heap, inasmuch as there is no other God who is able to deliver in this way." He was done with the fiery furnace, and he's back to threatening to make little cubes out of people and make their houses dung piles. Not the best way to be an evangelist. Not the most effective way to share the gospel. God never forces himself on anyone, and neither should we force him on someone. They have to make that decision on their own. I wish we could decide for others. I've got a few loved ones that I wish I could make a decision for them to come to Christ and be saved, but we can't do that. I can't make up their mind for them. You can't make up their mind for them, and God won't make them decide either. He gives them enough proof to come to a conclusion, but he won't force them to love him against their will. Neither love nor worship really are love or worship if they are forced.